Round one. Fight!
Fatal Fury, the first fighting game released for the Neo Geo arcade system in 1991, made by Takashi Nishiyama, the man behind Capcom's first Street Fighter game. Fatal Fury was considered to be the true spiritual successor to the original Street Fighter game, even though Capcom's actual sequel Street Fighter 2 was being released around the same time. The two games went head to head in the arcade, Fatal Fury being released a mere few months after Street Fighter 2. Did Capcom's new take on Street Fighter conquer all and prove a worthy successor, or was it surpassed by the series creators' new vision? Let's take a look at Fatal Fury, the King of Fighters, and see if it could do the impossible and prove a worthy competitor to Street Fighter 2. Street Fighter, the original game, did not set the fighting game genre alight. It was a decent game, if not a bit rough around the edges. A lot of people, myself included, never had any exposure to it, and would quite often wonder when playing Street Fighter 2, what the hell was the original? It was pretty much an unknown. Being released on the Street Fighter Anniversary Collection has given the game much more exposure these days, yet anyone who plays it realises very quickly that it pales in comparison to Street Fighter 2. Special moves are extremely difficult to pull off, and totally different button combinations to the ones we became accustomed to in Street Fighter 2. It's slow and laggy, and while the animation is decent for its time, it's not timeless like the original. Essentially, every gameplay mechanic is just average and would be refined to perfection in its sequel. Street Fighter 2 is a legendary game that lit a fire underneath the fighting game genre, changing it forever. It redefined what a fighting game was and influenced all of the fighting games that came after. To this day, it's still one of, if not the best fighting game ever made, and put Capcom on the map. The original Street Fighter director, Takashi Nishiyama, had zero involvement in Street Fighter 2, and had instead moved from Capcom to SNK to work on something entirely new. At SNK, he gave birth to Fatal Fury, which would spawn three of the greatest fighting game franchises of all time: Fatal Fury, Art of Fighting, and King of Fighters. Being released a few months after Street Fighter 2 meant that Fatal Fury was overlooked as a mere rip-off. However, it is a very different game, which works both in its favour and to its detriment. You can only play as 3 characters in Fatal Fury, which pales in comparison to Street Fighter 2. Part of the reason for this is that the game has more of a narrative. You enter the King of Fighters tournament to take revenge on Geese Howard, the man who killed your father, Jeff Bogard, years prior. You can play as one of the Bogard brothers or their friend Joe. It makes sense to keep a quest for revenge intimate to a group of 3, and while this works for the narrative drive, it makes for a more shallow experience in terms of gameplay. It is a severe handicap when making a comparison to Street Fighter 2 because that game had a wide array of characters and so much more depth in terms of learning how each fighter plays, which gave it much more replay value. The combat in Fatal Fury is largely designed around pulling off special moves. There are a wide variety of other attacks, but this game is not focused on performing combos. It is way too slow and sluggish for that. The game feels like you are fighting on the moon. Until you adapt to it, it feels extremely cumbersome and quite frustrating compared to the brisk and precise controls of Street Fighter 2. You have a mere 3-button input: kick, punch and move planes. That's it. Street Fighter 2 has a 6-button layout, which makes for much more varied fighting and the ability to pull off all kinds of combos. As I said before, Fatal Fury is geared towards special moves. However, pulling off special moves is an absolute chore. I swear that whenever you actually do a special move, it's down to luck more than skill. I get so frustrated with this game because I know I am doing the inputs correctly and half the time it doesn't register at all. I mean, maybe I suck and that's why they are not registering, but that doesn't feel right to me. In Fatal Fury, you can also move between 2 planes, the foreground and the background, and perform moves between the two. This is a nice addition and would be tweaked and changed as the series progressed. It gives the game its own identity to a certain extent. Overall, once you get your head around Fatal Fury's gameplay, it is enjoyable, and on the rare occasion you actually pull off a special move, it feels very satisfying. That being said, Street Fighter 2 is leagues above it in terms of gameplay. The game obviously has a similar look to Street Fighter 2, with character sprites being bright and cartoony. I'd say Street Fighter 2 has smoother and better animated characters on the whole, and this is why the gameplay feels more fluid. The characters are not just more numerous and better animated though. They're also more iconic and memorable than Fatal Fury. As the Fatal Fury series progressed, it would carve out its own set of iconic characters, but from the get-go, Street Fighter 2's characters were household names. For me, the backgrounds in Fatal Fury are far more interesting and dynamic than Street Fighter 2. Things are alive and moving in Fatal Fury, and there is much more going on. SNK have always had amazing background art in their fighting games, and it all started here with Fatal Fury. There are some really unique locations and effects going on that really create a great sense of atmosphere. Overall, I much prefer Fatal Fury's look to Street Fighter 2's. It's more colourful and vibrant, and there is just more to marvel at on screen. Take for example the transition in lighting as time passes between rounds. You just don't get anything like that in Street Fighter 2. In terms of music, Fatal Fury has a few standout tracks, but Street Fighter 2, pretty much every single track is awesome and legendary, so much so that the same tracks are still used today. So Street Fighter 2 wins hands down in the music department. So, is Fatal Fury as good as Street Fighter 2? Well, first off, it's not a rip-off like was claimed at the time. The games were released so close together that I don't see how one could copy the other. It looks better in my opinion, with much more detailed background art and more vibrant colours, and it does have more of a narrative arc to follow. However, no one can deny that Street Fighter 2 has much better gameplay, which is both smoother, faster and deeper. This is why it has stood the test of time and is still considered one of the best fighting games ever, because its gameplay stands out so much. Fatal Fury has nice elements to its gameplay and aesthetic that make it decent to play, but it cannot match the overall package of Street Fighter 2, which is quite frankly timeless. That being said, the Fatal Fury series would endure and continue well after the first game, and it can be argued that the series as a whole grew into something that ultimately surpassed the Street Fighter series. But that's a topic for another video. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider liking, sharing and subscribing, and check out Horizon Zero Dawn video game review for more awesome videos. Remember, Horizon Zero Dawn needs you. Until next time.